Alright, y'all, so today in this video, I want to talk about a really interesting and canceled version of an iconic movie that many of you have already probably seen. And if you look at the title of this video, today we're going to be talking about the original, much more darker version of The Mask, a iconic film from the 90s, one of my personal favorite Jim Carrey movies of all time, and in general, one of my favorite superhero films of the 90s. And I think it's pretty safe to say that the results that we got were pretty interesting, and obviously the end product was really good. But after doing some research into the movie, the production of it, the story of the making of it, there was a lot of interesting facts and tidbits and trivia that I found out, and we almost got a version of this movie that would have been a darker version of the movie that possibly would have had a wildly different plot, actors, and honestly more akin to the original Dark Horse comic books. So in this canceled video, I'm going to be covering the original canceled version of The Mask from 1994. So regardless, let's get into this. All right, or I guess another quote to really make a real quick example of, like the Mask would say in the film itself, "Let's rock this joint." So like my all my other canceled videos, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this, the content of this original darker version, why it was scrapped, and basically the aftermath, why we got the film that we got, and everything that came with that, and my overall opinions on this original darker version of The Mask. So regardless, let's get into it. So, to start with the background, originally, a lot of people don't know this. The Mask from 1994 is actually based on Dark Horse Comics. It was based on a comic book run, believe it or not. I think many people forget that technically The Mask was based on comic books, but it was. The Mask started out originally as part of an anthology series from Dark Horse Comics called, I believe, Dark Horse Presents. And the name of the mask itself, even the wording of it, it was originally called Mask, Masque, instead of course, the typical Mask. And it was quite a different, when the Mask debuted, it was part of an anthology series from Dark Horse Comics, and it looked quite different from what we got in the movie. For example, the character was not Stanley Ipkiss, and it was more of a political allegory, horror type story. Basically, whoever wore the mask, we would see the world from their point of view, and the world from their point of view would be this very abstract, dark, and distorted place. And the character became a very pulpy, almost shadow inspired character. And that was kind of the initial concept and idea. There's also some kind of political rhetoric with the original comic and in the anthology series. And it was also a black and white comic. And the Mask didn't have really too many supernatural abilities. It was more that he wore it, and everything would get distorted from the point of view, and you basically become some kind of crime fighter, if you will. But he wasn't necessarily like how he is now in the movie, or even in future comics, where he's basically a god, whoever wears the mask, so to speak. And that was the initial idea. Now, it really didn't, it was a pretty quick and short run series, Dark Horse Presents. It was discontinued, and eventually a new team of artists and writers were brought on the Dark Horse Comics to sort of revamp the mask and redo it for a whole new series. And this is where the basic crux of the 1994 movie begins. And I believe Richardson, who's the CEO of Dark Horse Comics, actually brought on some interesting people to do it. A person called Mankey was basically, he was kind of brought on to help work on the comic. Warner, which is another artist, I'm kind of using their last names here, came on to do the series, and it was part of another anthology series called Mayhem. And this is where the first real introduction of the mask begins. And eventually the series became popular enough that eventually kind of, sort of branched out to its own limited series. It was an ongoing series, but also the mask was kind of done the way where it's like 4 to 5 issues per story arc. But yeah, the basic crux of the idea and eventually the final film came from here. Stanley Ipkiss was created by this original comic run, and there's also plenty of other characters that came from the comics that made it to the movie. Detective Holloway was here. There's also other scenes and direct moments lifted from the comics, but like I mentioned in my review of the movie, it is wildly different. There's some, it reads almost like a superhero parody, but also a horror comic. It is very much a dark, nihilistic horror comic. Stanley Ipkiss in the original series is not a good person. He's arguably the darkest person to wear the mask and the entire mask run, if you will. And basically, kind of really quickly sum up the original comic run for Stanley Ipkiss. He buys a mask for his girlfriend, who, in this version, he has a girlfriend. And it's basically to make up for an argument that he got into it with the girlfriend the previous day. And he bought it, and eventually the girlfriend loves it, but you can tell there's some tension. You can tell that Stanley is not a good person. He also gets beat up by some bikers, really unfairly so. And the story is made similar to like the final film, right? Stanley is a down of his luck guy. He gets picked on, yada yada. The difference is that he actually fantasizes about beating these dudes up, which is natural. I'm sure a lot of people would. And eventually, he finds out really quickly that if he puts on the mask, by pure happen chance, he gets turned into this, the mask. Now, in the comic, it's called Big Head. So that's another big difference from the comic. And there's a lot of lines that are directly lifted from it. Like, for example, he realizes that the mask gives him godlike abilities. It seems like the wearer, too, is more aware of his surroundings when he wears it in the comic and can also easily take it off, while in the movie it's like it looks painful, and it's like a venomous drug or snake attached to a person when the mask gets on them. I prefer both versions regardless. But yeah, he puts on the mask and he's like, oh, I can be a superhero. But first, which is another line that they used in the movie, which I thought was great. And Stanley would basically go after anyone who had ticked him off for any reason. There's these mechanic guys that purposely sabotage his vehicle to charge him more money on future repairs. Messed up, but doesn't really justify because Stanley messes them up completely. He stuffs one of the dude's bodies into like a catalytic converter, like it's inside of his body. Somehow it's like distorted and he's dead. The other one is he's just completely mangled. In the movie, this scene happens, but it's completely toned down. Stanley also goes after the bikers that wronged him, completely murders them all, because this is a grotesque comic. Even the mask in the original comics has the ability to make himself look like a normal person, and then like kind of like a shed, like a disguise, if you will. And then eventually he peels off the skin to realize it's the mask underneath. A really creepy moment. And eventually Stanley just kind of goes insane. He kind of goes after anyone who ticks him off, even the random teacher from his childhood. Eventually it all stops when the girlfriend figures out Stanley is the mask and kills him to get the mask and stop this wild rampage. So yeah, wildly different from the final film. Now, how did we get the film, and why is there a darker version of it, so to speak? Well, Richardson, the CEO of Dark Horse Comics, wanted to make certain adaptations. He was kind of making a push to get his comics into the mainstream. It was the 90s, so making comic book movies weren't exactly the norm, but not unheard of. And I think Dark Horse got away with it a little bit more just because their comics weren't necessarily traditional superhero comics, right? But yeah, there was kind of a push. They made a push to get some of their properties made, and one of the big ones was The Mask. But initially, they had a lot of trouble getting it off the ground. They pitched it to various studios, and eventually New Line Cinema took, kind of an interesting studio themselves, and famously they love to gamble on projects and stuff. They really liked The Mask. They thought that it was a really cool comic book. They loved the horror vibe, and they bought the comic from Dark Horse Comics. Now, what's really interesting is the fact that I believe the CEO Richardson and Dark Horse themselves actually had a creative role. Like, I think they were present throughout the entire process of the movie. I could be mistaken, but they had some creative input, which is very rare because most cases you just buy the rights from the studio and the studio does whatever they want with it. So it's kind of interesting that they were still creatively involved with this. But New Line Cinema bought it, and the initial idea is that they really thought the comic was really cool and that they wanted to make it sort of a Freddy Krueger horror movie kind of vibe. They wanted another horror movie franchise. And they were starting to commission. Richardson did some drafts. They also hired some other writers to do some drafts. And the very early concepts of The Mask as a movie were pretty different from the final film. And New Line Cinema wanted to keep this a Freddy Krueger horror movie franchise. So pretty, I guess you can call it similar to the vibe of the comics, which are really horror themed and really much satirical in nature. Now, Mike Richardson, or probably not his name, but Richardson, the CEO of Dark Horse Comics, he, like I said, wrote some treatments for the film. He presented this idea of using Ted Avery cartoons as a sort of basis for the animated nature of The Mask. And this was an idea that he came up with. It wasn't really from the comic book. The idea that the mask could be really cartoony, could distort, could be zany in nature. That was kind of a concept that Richardson infused into the treatments and versions of the film that he was crafting. Now, there was a really early idea for The Mask, at least when they were basically doing the concept and making it into film. They basically had a lot of weird concepts. There was one version of an alleged script or treatment that basically, it was about a mask maker on the edge of town, and he was basically a serial killer. He would basically go around cutting faces off corpses, and he would put them on teenagers, and they would basically turn into zombies. That was one of the initial darker versions that they had for this film. Obviously, wildly different from the comic book, and of course, from the final film that we got. Just wildly different. Thank God they didn't do that. But yeah, that was one of the versions. It got praised, from what we know. That version got quickly canceled and nixed. Apparently, when Richardson was speaking about it years later, he basically said, yeah, that idea got nixed really early on. But there was also darker versions of the script that were starting to form. Allegedly, the tone was more closer to the original comic books and more satirical in nature. The idea initially was that the mask would go around and murder people, like in the comics, with extreme violence. And that was kind of the concept. It was kind of being positioned as a more like Freddy Krueger-like film. And New Line wanted that. They definitely wanted that. Eventually, they got brought on some additional screenwriters. They brought on a screenwriter called Mark Verheyen, who he also would make another Dark Horse comic into a film, Time Cop. I know, a pretty wild film in itself. And he would write a sort of version of the movie. There was also other people brought onto it. And, the initial plan, like I said, was not to make a comedy. The original idea and the early versions of the movie were more like a horror film. It was more violent, nihilistic, and, there was other things like the Tommy gun scene, which was ripped straight out of the comics, which was kind of a scene from the early comic books and stuff. But they were just kind of reworked and put into it. For example, the Tommy gun scene with the balloons, I believe was when Holloway had the mask on at that time. And he, it's the same thing similar to the comic, but he murders all the dudes in the alleyway. Something that, does not happen in the movie, and it's played off for laughs. But, yeah. And there was also other screenwriters attached to it. Mike Werb and Mike Fallon would also end up contributing to the final screenplay, and other people would happen. Now, the initial idea was going to make this a possible R-rated film. The early versions of the script were said to be more violent in nature, and it was going to be nihilistic, and there was going to be certain scenes and elements ripped from the comic, and it was going to be similar to that. Everything kind of changed when New Line eventually hired a director to do it. Now, the project at this point had stalled for multiple years. There was many false alarms, if you will, to get it off the ground. There was a couple versions of the script, and eventually New Line hired Chuck Russell. Now, Chuck Russell was already pretty familiar with New Line. He had just came off directing the Blob remake from 1988, and he also did the third Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which, shout out to those movies. Really enjoy both of them. And Chuck Russell was a pretty interesting choice to do it. Now, when he came in, he looked at the original comics, and he kind of came up with a completely different approach to the source material. He felt like, because when he came onto the project, the original version of The Mask was more of a horror movie. It was more nihilistic. It was more like the comic books. Russell came in and felt like he could do a different approach with it. He kind of wanted to do something more lighter, something that could be more considered a comedy. Now, this was a gradual process. He still stuck with some of the more hardcore and horror elements, but he wanted to kind of transform it into a more of an animated like film, a comedy, if you will. And when he met up with Richardson presented the Ted Avery idea and influence. That kind of stuck, and he eventually kind of sort of shifted the film away gradually into a more of a light-hearted comedy. Now, there was plenty of names and ideas, and Russell would also contribute to the final screenplay as well and the version of the movie. But this version of the movie was basically starting to be more and more like the final film. The original darker horror version, more similar to the comics, were kind of being transformed and radically altered by Russell into the more lighthearted film. He would take elements from the comics and certain scenes. Like I said, the mechanic scene ended up in the final movie. Detective Holloway ended up in the movie. The balloon scene came from the comics. Mismatched elements. But the big thing with Russell when he came onto the project is that he wanted to simplify things as well. If you've actually read the Mask comics, they're really cool, and I think they're great on their own. But, you know, there's multiple wearers of the mask. It's not just Stanley. Stanley just happens to be the first one we see in the comic. But, you know, he wanted to infuse certain scenes from the comic book's run, but infuse it down to one series of events and one character's arc and growth. And that character became Stanley. And he just mixed and matched multiple elements from the comic book run and put it down to a condensed nature. He definitely wanted to make it just one wearer of the mask. He didn't want to have multiple people wearing it in the movie, which I think was definitely the right choice. It made it much more of a focused experience. He also added some other elements to the story and the lore of the universe. For example, the Nordic element, the fact that we have the Loki's powers, and maybe even Loki himself infused into the mask, given its kind of magical properties, so to speak. That was something that also was created by Russell, since he was a big fan of Nordic mythology. Something that's also quite different from the comics, which never really kind of explained where the mask came from. It's hinted that it could have had a possible tribal and South American or African jungle background kind of root to it. Richardson said there was some kind of ancestral magical element brought up through generations, but that was completely scrapped for the movie. Just Russell kind of went with this more Nordic version of the events, which I'm fine with either one. It's pretty cool that he even bothered to explain it in the movie itself. Now, this was a pretty interesting movie. It was starting to gear up for production, slowly but surely. The budget was going to be actually pretty small, and the article that I read for the research of this movie, research of this video, kind of mentions that this movie was an indie film at heart. It was an indie film at heart, and it was made with that attitude, which makes sense. New Line Cinema is a famous studio for, kind of showcasing gambling on indie films, and it was kind of made with that nature. For the visual effects, they were kind of gearing up and figuring out how the hell they were going to do all the VFX that was going to be required to do the mask and all the weird iterations of Stanley using his powers when he's wearing the mask and stuff. And initially, there was kind of a couple ideas to do this. They eventually got ILM to do it, and they started to work on the movie in 1992 to 1993. And the images I'm using for this video come from a 1993 press kit that was released by New Line Cinema alongside ILM. And they were basically concept art and kind of mock digital designs and just proof of concepts of what they wanted to do initially with the mask. And as you can see for the image of this video, they look wildly different to the final film. They honestly look more distorted and creepy looking and really uncanny. Like, you can tell the tone they were going for, like this exaggerated Ted Avery-like style. But it feels like they're going more realistic with it and trying to look more... They're trying to make it look more, I guess, with the textures and stuff, just, like I said, more realistic. But there's this image that came. This is the cover of the press kit on the bottom left. Features a different costume that Stanley didn't wear in the movie, but you can tell the vibe and the tone and the time period they're going for. He's wearing some suspenders. The head looks a bit small. And the mask itself looks kind of like... for whatever reason, the head looks smaller and the face looks more like Jim Carrey. Kind of strange. And there's also some smaller images on the left that feature some exaggerated tongues and all this crazy stuff. Really, interesting, weird things they added there. And there's also, on the right, just some creepy stuff they were going for. Like I said, it seems like they were going for more of a kind of vibe from the comics, but it looks like they were trying to just put Carrey's face on the mask and not do anything else in terms of prosthetics, like a possible rubber mask. Same thing with him pulling it off, which is kind of the vibe similar to the movie itself, but just less so. And he also got him distorting the mask, using his powers to distort into a human-like dog thing. Yeah, looks pretty creepy. And, you have to remember these are just early tests, and this was just a press kit. But you can totally get the vibe they were going for, and I'm glad they definitely changed and altered it for the final film. Now, that kind of also brings me back to my next topic, casting. Now, there was, believe it or not, Jim Carrey, was not the initial choice for the mask. They were looking for other people that could possibly play the role. Russell was looking at various actors. Initially, the studio was kind of thinking about Rick Moranis or Martin Short. Even Robin Williams was floated around for the title role. And, all really interesting choices. I think Rick Moranis would have done a pretty interesting version of The Mask. But all these guys are being considered. Russell himself was hugely considering Nicolas Cage to do it. Apparently, I guess he was I guess at some point, he basically saw Nicolas Cage backstage at a Jerry Lewis concert, and I guess they met up and thought, man, Nicolas Cage would be a really good choice for The Mask. The Russell's personal list, and initially who he wanted to play it, was Nicolas Cage, like I said, but also Matthew Broderick for the role, which is a really interesting choice. Apparently, Broderick would later turn it down, but really interesting stuff. But eventually, Russell saw at the Comedy Store a stand-up bit by a local comedian, up-and-coming comedian, so to speak, Jim Carrey, who at the time, he wasn't a big, huge success and actor that we know of him today. He was from a 90s kind of SNL-like show called In Living Color. He was basically known around town as the white guy from In Living Color, because I think he was the only white guy on the cast, but I can't remember. And he was kind of this up and coming artist, or not artist, but comedian. And he had this huge, great ability to distort his face. He was one of the best comedians, in my opinion, to do impressions. He was incredible. And he was completely sold on his performance. He also heard from other producers about him and eventually completely determined this is the guy for The Mask. And later versions of the screenplay were tailor-made and written for him. So that eventually when Jim Carrey was asked to basically play The Mask in the lead role, he read the script and was like, man, it feels like this was written for me. That's just because by this point they had written a later version that was specifically tailored for him. Mike DeLuca, one of the executives, CEO at New Line, apparently saw the comedic tape after Russell showed it to him and the producers and really enjoyed his performance and felt like he would be the perfect person for The Mask. And I mean, it's pretty clear why. I mean, Carrey, can distort his face. He has crazy exaggerations and mannerisms. And honestly, he's perfect for such a manic and animated character like The Mask. I mean, that's just genius casting right there. But yeah, Jim Carrey was selected for the role, and he was paid, I think, roughly about $400,000, which, at the time you have to remember, that was a pretty small sum. The studio got him on a bargain just because he wasn't the big hit actor yet, and he wasn't getting paid like $20 million a film yet at that point. So he was still an up-and-coming unknown actor. So it was a pretty big gamble to hire him at the time to play the lead role. Now, there were also some other actors that were being considered for interesting roles. Another particular one is Tina. Obviously, if you don't know her, she was Tina Carlisle, the female love interest character in the movie, famously played by Cameron Diaz. Now, originally, she was not the original choice for the role. Now, the idea for this character, when they were writing the script and coming up with the story concepts, is that they basically wanted someone that would be like Jessica Rabbit from Roger Rabbit. Someone that was like this super curvy, really much flirtatious, hot female character that, you kind of see in a lot of those early cartoons. Like that really sexy female fatale character. Now, in early versions of the script, she was originally more of a bad girl, so to speak. Like, she was that really hard-to-get girl, and that, at the end of the movie, predictably, like a lot of other audiences would have expected, she would be a bad person. She would be basically siding with Dorian, betraying Stanley's trust, yada yada. Now, one thing I really like about the final film that we got is that they kind of subverted that trope. It's kind of ironic. The really hot and, curvy female love interest character who most audiences would expect to be the bad person turns out to be actually the most honest one at heart and actually a good person deep down. Now, there's some really interesting deleted scenes that I'll get into a little bit later, but that's one of the real cool things. And there's another character called Peggy who, on the surface, is kind of this hardworking and seemingly honest character, but then turns out she's not really who she says she is. And at the end of the day, she turns out to betray Stanley at the end. I really like how they presented that trope, and it's really cool. But originally, like I said, Tina was more of she was actually a bad character. She would turn out to betray Stanley and just be the typical trope that we see in a lot of these movies. But that was kind of a last-minute revision as the film was getting closer to filming and such in production. Now back to casting. There was a bunch of names considered for the role, but the director, Chuck Russell, really wanted Anna Nicole Smith, who was a huge popular model at the time in the 90s, and she almost did the movie. She was pretty much signed on to play the role, and then at the last minute, she kind of backed out because she wanted to do the Naked Gun 33 1/3, the final insult, and sort of do like a bit part, I guess, / cameo for that movie. And she backed out at the last minute. And the director was absolutely crushed because he really wanted her to play the role, and he almost kind of gave up on the movie initially. But, they didn't give up, and eventually they were apparently, when they were looking for scouting for potential people, Apparently, the director were at some kind of academy party, and there was also like a runway show, and they saw Cameron Diaz, who at the time was not an actor. She was a straight up model. She had no previous acting experience, but they immediately found out and felt, well, she would actually be the perfect person. This is exactly what we're looking for. So they basically got her involved in the process, and they really wanted her, but the studio and New Line felt very unsure about her, and they basically had her come and audition many times. I think it was over 10 times, I believe 13 times in total. Not exactly sure, but she auditioned. She did some auditions with Jim Carrey himself, and eventually she won the part. Pretty crazy for an actor who's had no acting experience, and I think she was either graduating high school or just about to graduate high school when she got involved with this, and I think she was like 21 when she started filming. Not exactly sure, but really crazy stuff. The fact is, she had no acting experience and was a pretty, even more of a bigger gamble for her to be in the movie, arguably, than Jim Carrey was. But she was cast, and basically your early set of actors was put into place. Now, they shot most of this movie in Los Angeles when filming actually did finally start, and they shot most of it in Los Angeles, mostly on set. Like I said, it was kind of done with the spirit of an indie film, but with ILM involved, which they also really wanted to be involved to do the VFX for this film, and they actually took a little bit of a pay cut, like a cheaper rate than they usually do for their other films, just because The Mask was a really different film from other films they were doing at the time, which were mainly big space films and Jurassic Park and such. The Mask was like something they've never really done at all before. They wanted to get into more comedic films and try things like that, and The Mask was the perfect opportunity, so they just really enjoyed it and took a pay cut to do it, which is awesome. But yeah, they shot most of it on location, and I think the only set that was built for the movie was Stanley's bedroom. So really interesting filming kind of thing right there. Now for the mask prosthetics, originally Jim Carrey was given a rubber mask. They were going to do a rubber mask, and that's the idea and the approach they were going to do. But eventually it was decided that the rubber mask was hiding too much of Carrey's face. You couldn't really see his distortions, his manic expressions and such. So the idea was that they were going to do this practically. They wanted to do it as practically as possible, which is, I think, a really good thing and makes the film look great. So they decided to use prosthetics, and he would basically put prosthetic pieces around certain muscles of the face that not hide Carrey's face, but to make it similar to the comics, but also kind of still be able to show Jim Carrey's face, and he can express his face in natural ways that a face would normally express itself. And the prosthetics took about 4 hours each day Jim Carrey came in to do it. And originally the big buck teeth that the mask have when, Carrey puts on the mask and stuff was originally only designed to be for certain shots of the movie, but then they were incorporated for all the scenes that he was in the mask. So really cool fun facts right there, and really interesting how the whole process started. Now, in terms of the visual look of the movie, why the film kind of looks like the 40s, this came from the Ted Avery cartoons inspiration that kind of came from the early concepts and designs for the movie. Also, the idea was that they were going to kind of give the film a 40s retro, timeless quality. Now, they didn't have the budget to do a completely 40s setting, but they were kind of making it where it's like there's a bunch of 40s inspired themes, choices, world building, costumes and such in the movie, but still set in, at the time, modern day 90s with some modern day technology. And it kind of gave the film really a timeless quality that I think is the reason why even 20 to 30 years plus, the film still looks great. And that's part of the fact that they kind of wanted to get that timeless quality from the beginning, so it's really cool. Even some of the outfits in the movie, famously the yellow suit that Carrey wears in that club scene when he became the Mask, that was actually a design choice that came from Carrey himself. It was inspired by a stand-up suit that he wore sometimes on stage. It was like a yellow jacket, and that came apparently from his father, apparently. And the idea is that they were going to imitate that for The Mask. And that was a really cool, interesting design choice. Now, to kind of get into also the further techniques with the filming and the production of the movie, and this part of it I already mentioned, but ILM got involved with the project, and this movie was kind of also a pioneer for integrating VFX and live action together. It was really cool stuff, and a big thing that also happened, and really one of the things that actually made the film cheaper to make, was the fact that Jim Carrey himself was involved. So like when the director would say, okay, so The Mask is going to have you animated and distort into a wolf, like from that one scene where he kind of turned into an animated wolf, like a Ted Avery cartoon. I think the wolf character from that turns into that, and he's whistling for Cameron Diaz's character, Tina. She's singing and dancing in the club. Well, when the actor would basically, the director tell the actor to, hey, this is what you're going to do. Can you kind of animate yourself to look like that? Carrey was able to do that really effectively. And when ILM, in post-production and VFX work, got in to basically replace him and put him in with CGI, sometimes, like I said, his animated expressions actually made it easier for them to animate and, put CGI on top, or at some points just simply enhance certain shots. And it was just a lot easier. I think it was reported that he saved the film over $1 million because sometimes, the animated expressions he would do with his face and everything like that actually saved the VFX team and the budget in the film itself $1 million in savings, and it would save the people time in post. Even when he was actually just a normal mask get-up and makeup, the VFX team really didn't do anything. Even when there were certain moments where, he would become more animated or do certain things with the mask, they would only slightly touch it up and enhance certain shots and obviously do more CGI replacement with certain other scenes, but it was just easier with Carrey. So that's a really cool and interesting part about it. And, it's a really cool part of the fact that Jim Carrey was involved like that, and he saved the film money. And, there's also some really other interesting things, and I'm also going to kind of get in some other cut content that was kind of designed for the movie that never made it in. For example, there was a whole prologue in the movie that kind of more explained the origins of the mask, how, it was kind of these powers, or even Loki himself, the embodiment of his powers and such that were trapped in this Nordic mask. And these Nordic, these kind of Vikings, so to speak, show up to America. I believe the first one ever, actually, I think is Ike, I forget his name, but the one Viking explorer that showed up, that was actually the first one to discover North America. We get to see him arrive on the shore with a bunch of other people, and it kind of explains more of the energy and the Loki energy getting trapped into the mask and how they buried it and how it was meant to be never to be found. And has kind of explained more prologue and the backstory to the whole narrative. And this was included in the original cut of the movie, and it made it to some test screenings, but eventually it was cut out because people just felt they weren't interested into it. They wanted to see the Jim Carrey stuff, so it was quickly cut out. Apparently it wasn't finished either. If you've watched the deleted scene on YouTube, there's some buildings and stuff they forgot to remove, and I think originally the ship was meant to be VFX, like a digital ship, but it obviously didn't make the final cut, but it's still pretty interesting. There was also a work print for the movie that kind of got leaked eventually. Now, work print is kind of a editor's initial version of scenes that were kind of put together, and obviously then after multiple test screenings and different revisions, things would get cut down. But what's really cool is if you look up on YouTube, there's tons of these work print scenes, and even though the quality is really bad, there's many scenes that I wish was what kept in the movie. For example, there's slight scenes and changes. For example, there's more depth in the Tina's character, how she may have done things that she didn't want to stay alive, so to speak. And you also get to see Dorian's more possessive and mean personality of how he controls Tina, and how basically mentioning how basically his previous past relationships he alleged to have them killed. Really crazy stuff. There's also small things like Tina pulls out a knife on some mobsters, which that part was cut out. There's also some further scenes of Carrie and some extended jokes from The Mask. But all that is really cool. I'm assuming that a lot of these scenes were cut out due to certain tone, and they probably didn't want to make the movie too. Like, it was a comedy, so they didn't want to make it too serious. And also, they probably wanted to keep the runtime below 2 hours. So I'm assuming that's why some of these scenes were cut. But still, it's really interesting to look at all this stuff in hindsight. There's also a musical number in the film, probably one of the most famous musical number in the movie. Of course, we're going to talk about the Cuban Pete scene, where he's distracting an entire army of cops as The Mask when Stanley's wearing it, and, does some crazy stuff. It's one of my favorite parts of the movie. But originally, the studio wanted to cut this out. When they didn't actually see the scene, they heard it was being made, they were just completely confused. They're like, why is this even in the movie? Really weird stuff. But they eventually saw it, they loved it, and eventually it was left in the movie, which I think was a great thing. I think even Russell said that if it wasn't in there, he probably would have left. So, really cool stuff. Now, there was also a really tight production timetable, and there was really, a lot of days stacked onto each other to get this film done. And it was such a tight nut and rush schedule that Carey himself had, apparently during the night shoots when he was becoming The Mask, had a flu. He had flu. He had the flu, so to speak. And he was sick. He was throwing up. And there were certain scenes that he just, physically, it was hard for him to do it. Sometimes the producers would actually have to help him out of the trailer sometimes because the flu was that bad. And basically, basically, if Carey wasn't able to shoot a certain scene for that day, they wouldn't have been able to shoot it in reshoots and such, because the production was so much. It was very tight knit, and they didn't have the money or the budget to go back and reshoot certain stuff. This is obviously would completely change when Carey became a big time actor, but apparently, he was really sick for some of the shoot and just had to push through it, and they couldn't afford to reshoot and add scenes later. So that's kind of a really interesting thing about this movie and how, frankly, low budget it was and how much of a gamble it was. So really interesting kind of tidbit in history about this movie. There's also some pretty cool things. Apparently the dog in the movie, famously Milo, one of my favorite dogs ever on film, was a really good dog. There was obviously, I think, 2 dogs that were used, but the dog that we see in most of the movie is the one that we see basically performing all of the stunts, which is very rare apparently for dogs in film. He was just a very great dog, which I think makes sense, and obviously we love Milo, so it's really cool, and it's a little fun fact about the dog and such. Now, initially when the film was coming out, they were New Line was kind of predicting the film might break even about 30 to 35 million. And obviously, it did way more than that. It made about 125 million domestically and 350 million worldwide. Huge success, especially considering the budget. And it was a huge breakout role for Jim Carrey. And it did what it did. And obviously, the film that we got is pretty great. Even though it's wildly different from the comics, it's really great. And that's kind of the story, the little bit of the production, the little bit of the history, the little bit of the background, and the history of the original canceled, darker version of it. Now, to kind of quickly wrap up, basically to summarize certain things and give you my thoughts on it, when The Mask was being developed in the original Dark Horse comics, it was a much more darker, satirical thing. When New Line bought the rights, they wanted to make it similar to that, a Freddy Krueger horror-like franchise, and they were basically kind of shopping around different versions, getting different writers to write versions of the script that were described as much more darker, closer to the comics. Characters in it would have been nihilistic. The Mask would have been running around killing people like Freddy Krueger. I already mentioned one of those versions was a wild concept that it was about a mask maker that would rip off faces of corpses and put them on teenagers to control them. Wild concept. but that version got quickly scrapped, and eventually, the script slowly over time morphed into more and more of a comedic and lighthearted film. And then when Chuck Russell was brought on to direct, he wanted to go completely different in terms of direction. He felt like the comics, were too similar to what he had basically done with Freddy Krueger, and he wanted to do something much more lighthearted, similar to Ted Avery cartoons, and make it more like a comedy. And eventually got Jim Carrey, and that decision also influenced the tone of the movie, as he wanted to make it more lighthearted. And of course, we got that version of the movie that we got in the final film, and the darker, more, I guess you can call it, possibly accurate version of the comics was scrapped. And now to kind of give you my overall opinions on this lost version of the movie. I think on one hand, after reading the comics too, I think I do want to see a version of the mask that's similar to the older comics, because I think there is something special in those older comics and how dark and nihilistic it all was. But I think honestly, I do think too, like later statements, especially made by Richardson, the CEO of Dark Horse, he would say that, like, even though the film sort of drastically changed from the tone of the comics, it basically would have not had the big appeal and mass audience appeal that a lighthearted comedic film did. And that's absolutely true. If they went ahead and made this R-rated dark version of it, number one, Jim Carrey might not have been involved with it. And number two, it just probably would have not been a huge success as the film that we got did. And I think in a lot of ways it was a great thing. And, what's kind of remarkable is my opinion is, even though I do want to see in the future a version of the mask that's similar to the comics, it's violent in nature, I think the film we got, struck a really nice, delicate balance in its tone and its style. And I think for the most part, it holds up really well. It's not disrespectful to a degree to the source material. It treats it pretty accurately. There's many scenes ripped from the comics, many lines of dialogue ripped from the comics. And I think I can definitely tell there's a sense of artistic respect for what was in the comic books. But I think that the changes being made, the fact that it's more of a comedy that's really lighthearted, it strikes a delicate balance. And I think, in a lot of ways, I'm not too happy when films deviate so much from the source material. But I think in this case, it actually makes a lot of sense. And I think it struck a chord and made a really solid and well-balanced, lighthearted comedy with all the right actors involved at the right points in their career, obviously. And I think it came out all for the better. Now, I still want to see a darker reboot in the future of this, maybe similar to the comics. But I think this was a really good movie, has a really nice, timeless quality to it. And I think ultimately we were still better off despite the fact we never got the early, darker version of this movie. But yeah, that's kind of my overall opinions on this version, this canceled version of The Mask that we could have gone from the 90s, this horror version. Also a little bit of a history of the production and just kind of some fun facts and trivia about the film's making of. I probably missed tons of things, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of make this video. If you listen to it all the way through, thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support, and, hopefully you'll have a good day. So to speak, let's kind of quote the movie, so to speak, smoking. All right, peace, y'all. Hopefully you have a nice day.